Tonight, the Persian Gulf has witnessed an event that will be studied in every naval war college, analyzed in every defense ministry, and debated in every strategic studies institution on the planet for the next generation. What unfolded in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz in the past 24 hours is not a skirmish, not an incident, not a miscalculation requiring careful diplomatic management. It is a catastrophe of the first strategic order, one that has rewritten the naval balance of power in the world's most critical waterway, and delivered to American military credibility a wound whose depth the Pentagon's public communications apparatus is wholly inadequate to conceal. The USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier representing the absolute apex of American naval engineering, carrying 90 aircraft, a crew of nearly 6,000 souls, and the full symbolic weight of American global military dominance, has been struck, catastrophically damaged, and confirmed lost in the Persian Gulf following a coordinated Iranian ballistic missile assault of a scale and precision that has shattered every assumption the American military establishment held about what its adversaries could actually do. 1,500 Sejjil ballistic missiles, the number alone deserves a moment of absolute stillness. Not a handful of missiles designed to demonstrate capability and signal resolve. Not a calibrated strike calculated to impose cost without crossing the threshold of existential challenge. 1,500 ballistic missiles fired in coordinated waves, saturating the most sophisticated naval air defense system ever deployed, and finding, through the mathematical inevitability of volume combined with precision, the gaps that no finite defensive architecture can eliminate. 6,000 sailors missing in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The human dimension of this catastrophe is so vast that the institutional machinery of American military communications has not yet found the language to convey it to the public. The silence from the Pentagon in the hours since the engagement is itself the loudest statement available. The silence of an institution that has absorbed a shock for which no press guidance was ever prepared, because no planning document ever seriously modeled this outcome as an operational probability. In the White House, in the National Security Council, in the classified briefing rooms where American strategy is made, the atmosphere is one that no current official has experienced before. Not in the Gulf Wars, not in Afghanistan, not in any of the regional interventions and proxy conflicts that have defined American military engagement across the past 3 decades. This is different. This is the loss of a carrier. This is 6,000 missing people. This is the operational demonstration conducted at full scale in the most strategically significant waterway on the planet, that the instrument of American global power projection, the carrier strike group, is vulnerable in ways that American strategic doctrine refused to fully internalize. Tonight, this channel is going to answer every question that the official narrative is managing away. How did 1,500 Sejjil missiles overwhelm the most advanced naval air defense system on Earth? What does the Sejjil program actually represent in terms of capability, doctrine, and strategic intent? What is the true state of American decision-making in the aftermath of this catastrophe? And what does a global order look like when the aircraft carrier, the symbol that has underwritten American hegemony since 1945, is revealed as a liability rather than an asset in the threat environment that Iran has constructed? Stay with us. Every part of this story demands the depth that only this channel provides. Before we go further, if this channel is where you come for the analysis that the mainstream information ecosystem cannot deliver, hit like, subscribe, and drop your assessment in the comments. What does the sinking of the Abraham Lincoln mean for the future of American power? We read every response, because the conversation this community generates around events of this magnitude is as important as the analysis itself. 4 questions. The 4 questions that every admiral in the United States Navy, every defense minister watching from Tokyo to Warsaw, and every Gulf state capital conducting an emergency strategic reassessment is asking right now, and that virtually no mainstream outlet has the technical depth or the institutional independence to answer honestly. First, the USS Abraham Lincoln was operating with its full strike group complement. Guided missile cruisers, Aegis-equipped destroyers, attack submarines in screening positions, the complete layered defensive architecture that American naval doctrine designates as sufficient to manage the ballistic missile threat from regional adversaries. 1,500 Sejjil missiles defeated every layer of that architecture simultaneously. Was this a magazine exhaustion failure? A fire control saturation failure? A failure of the electronic warfare environment that Aegis depends upon to function? Or has Iran specifically engineered the Sejjil's salvo architecture to exploit the mathematical limits of Aegis engagement capacity in ways that American threat assessment systematically refused to attribute to Iranian ballistic missile doctrine? Second, the Sejjil is a two-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers. It has been in the Iranian inventory and various developmental iterations since 2008. American and Israeli intelligence services have been tracking this program for 16 years. The salvo architecture that defeated the Abraham Lincoln strike group, the volume, the multi-axis approach geometry, the sequencing designed to exploit reload windows, represents an operational concept that should have been modelable from publicly available information about Sejjil production rates and deployment doctrine. Where was the threat assessment that should have generated the defensive adaptations that might have changed this outcome? Third, the attack required real-time targeting data of extraordinary precision against a moving carrier strike group operating in one of the most heavily surveilled bodies of water on the planet. Targeting a moving naval formation with ballistic missiles requires space-based sensors, over-the-horizon radar, and a data processing architecture capable of translating raw sensor data into actionable fire control solutions within operationally relevant timelines. When did Iran develop this maritime targeting architecture, and what does its operational maturity tonight tell us about the depth of technical cooperation with partners whose names American diplomatic language is careful to avoid? And fourth, Iran fired 1,500 Sejjil missiles tonight. Its production infrastructure, dispersed across hardened underground facilities specifically designed to survive Israeli and American air interdiction campaigns, is estimated to be producing at rates that make tonight's consumption a manageable fraction of its strategic reserve. If this was not Iran's maximum effort, and the operational evidence suggests it was not, what does Iran do next? What is the follow-on operation that a military establishment of this sophistication has already planned for the strategic window that the carrier's loss has opened? Let us get into it. To appreciate the full operational achievement of what Iran executed tonight, you need to understand the specific problem that a carrier strike group's defensive architecture is designed to solve, and the specific way that Iran's operational planners engineered a solution to defeating it. The USS Abraham Lincoln entered the Persian Gulf as part of a strike group deployment that Washington had authorized as a deterrence signal, a visible demonstration of American military commitment to the security of Gulf shipping lanes and to the broader regional order that Iran's escalating operational tempo had been systematically challenging. The carrier was accompanied by its full strike group complement, guided missile cruisers equipped with the Aegis combat system and standard missile interceptors, destroyers in screening formations, attack submarines operating in sanitized approach lanes, and the full suite of electronic warfare assets that constitute the most capable naval defensive architecture ever assembled at sea. American naval doctrine held, and had held for decades through every war game and every threat assessment, that a carrier strike group's layered defenses could manage the ballistic missile threat that regional adversaries might plausibly generate. The doctrine was built on specific assumptions about the volume of simultaneous engagements that Aegis-equipped ships could process, about the effectiveness of terminal phase interceptors against ballistic trajectories, and about the electromagnetic warfare environment within which all of these systems would operate. Iran spent years studying those assumptions, and then it built a capability specifically designed to invalidate them. The engagement began in the pre-dawn hours, when Iranian early warning networks confirmed the Abraham Lincoln strike group's position with a precision that itself signals the maturity of Iranian maritime surveillance capability. Imaging satellites, over-the-horizon radar systems, submarine acoustic tracking, and the network of commercial vessel monitoring that provides continuous positional data on major naval movements, all fed targeting solutions into the Iranian ballistic missile command architecture in the hours before the first launch order was given. The operational concept behind Sejjil employment tonight was elegant in its brutality. A carrier strike group's air defense system, however sophisticated, has finite processing capacity. A maximum number of simultaneous engagements that its radar networks can track, its fire control systems can manage, and its interceptor magazines can service. Iranian operational planners did not attempt to defeat Aegis through technical superiority on a system-by-system basis. They defeated it through arithmetic. 1,500 missiles launched in coordinated waves from dispersed positions across Iranian territory created a target load that exceeded the engagement capacity of every defensive system in the strike group simultaneously. The first wave was designed not to strike the carrier, but to exhaust it. Hundreds of Sejjil missiles on depressed trajectories, flight profiles that reduce warning time and complicate the engagement geometry for terminal phase interceptors, descended on the strike group from multiple vectors simultaneously. The Aegis systems on accompanying destroyers and cruisers began processing targets and firing interceptors at the maximum rate their systems permitted. Standard Missile 3 interceptors, designed specifically for ballistic missile defense, flew in numbers that consumed magazines built for sustained operations across days of moderate threat, not for a single engagement of this intensity. As the first wave consumed interceptor stockpiles and processing bandwidth, the second wave was already in terminal phase. The Sejjil's solid fuel propulsion provides a launch-to-flight timeline that compresses the warning window available to defensive systems to a level where magazine reconstitution between waves is physically impossible. Each ship in the strike group was individually saturated in sequence, its outer defensive layers exhausted before the main hull attack sub-salvo arrived. The electromagnetic warfare dimension of the engagement added a layer of complexity that post-event assessments are still working to fully characterize. Iranian electronic warfare systems, drawing on Russian technical cooperation and years of indigenous development, created a degraded electromagnetic environment around the strike group that affected the coherence of Aegis radar tracking data and introduced latency into fire control communications between ships. In an engagement where milliseconds determine whether an interceptor reaches its target before impact, this degradation had consequences that compounded across the volume of simultaneous engagements. The Abraham Lincoln's own close-in weapon systems, the last layer of terminal defense, the phalanx guns and short-range missiles designed to engage threats that have penetrated all outer layers, faced a terminal phase environment of multiple simultaneous incoming warheads, arriving at angles and velocities that exceeded the designed engagement envelope. These systems performed exactly as designed. It was not sufficient. Multiple hits were recorded. The carrier's damage control parties fought with the professionalism and courage that United States Navy training produces. But the physics of the situation they faced were beyond what damage control procedures can overcome when structural hits are of sufficient number and severity. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a warship displacing over 100,000 tons and representing the accumulated naval engineering achievement of the world's most capable maritime power, sank in the Persian Gulf. 6,000 sailors, some were recovered by accompanying vessels in search and rescue operations, conducted under conditions of extraordinary operational danger. Many were not. The search continues. The Sejjil ballistic missile is not an improvised weapon. It is not a modified civilian rocket or an adapted artillery system. It is the product of a dedicated, sustained, strategically focused weapons development program that Iran initiated with the explicit objective of creating a capability to threaten and ultimately defeat American carrier strike groups. The specific instrument of military power that Washington has used to project coercive force into the Persian Gulf region across decades of regional engagement. Understanding the Sejjil program requires understanding the strategic logic that drove its creation. When Iran's military and strategic planners examined the regional security environment in the years following the Gulf War of 1991 and the initial American deployment of carrier forces to the Gulf, they identified the carrier strike group as simultaneously the most consequential threat to Iranian strategic security and the most significant vulnerability in American regional power projection. Defeat the carrier, and you defeat the mechanism through which American military dominance translates into regional political outcomes. The first Sejjil test, conducted in 2008, represented the initial operational expression of this strategic logic. a two-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers. It demonstrated the basic technical capability: solid-fuel propulsion for rapid launch preparation, sufficient range to cover the entire Gulf and beyond, a re-entry vehicle capable of surviving atmospheric entry and delivering a warhead with meaningful accuracy. The Sejjil variant that formed the core of tonight's engagement is a substantially more capable system. The guidance package has been refined across multiple test series to achieve circular error probable measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, a precision level that transforms a ballistic missile from an area effect weapon into a genuine precision strike system against specific ship classes. The warhead options available include conventional high-explosive penetrators, specifically designed for the structural vulnerabilities of large surface combatants, cluster munitions optimized for above-deck systems destruction, and thermobaric variants designed to maximize effect in enclosed spaces. The maneuvering re-entry vehicle technology that Iran has integrated into the current Sejjil generation represents perhaps the most significant technical advancement in the program's history, and the advancement that most directly undermines the defensive calculations on which American carrier protection doctrine was built. A ballistic missile on a standard trajectory follows a predictable flight path that terminal defense systems can calculate and intercept with high reliability. A maneuvering re-entry vehicle alters its trajectory during the terminal phase, executing lateral and vertical maneuvers that force the interceptor to track a moving target rather than a predictable one, dramatically reducing interception probability. The SM-3 interceptors in the American naval inventory were not specifically designed to counter this maneuvering capability. That gap was identified in classified assessments. The institutional momentum of existing procurement programs did not move to close it with the urgency the threat warranted. The production scale of the Sejjil program is itself a strategic statement. 1,500 missiles fired in a single engagement implies a stockpile substantially larger than that number. Iran would not commit its entire strategic reserve to a single operation. The investment required to produce, store, maintain, and operationally deploy a ballistic missile force of this scale, under comprehensive sanctions, under repeated physical attack against the program's infrastructure, and in the face of sustained international pressure to abandon it, reflects a level of national strategic commitment that Western analysts consistently underweighted in their assessments of Iranian capability. The dispersed basing architecture of the Sejjil force is as strategically significant as the missiles themselves. Launchers are not concentrated in fixed, targetable facilities. They are distributed across hardened underground shelters throughout Iranian territory, using mobile transporter erector launchers that can relocate between firing positions and that present a targeting problem requiring persistent surveillance across an enormous geographic area to resolve. Preemptive strike against the Sejjil force requires finding, fixing, and striking hundreds of mobile launchers dispersed across a country the size of Western Europe, many of them underground, all capable of movement between the time a surveillance asset identifies their position and the time a strike weapon arrives. The targeting architecture that enabled tonight's engagement deserves specific recognition as an operational achievement in its own right. Striking a moving naval target with ballistic missiles requires real-time targeting data of sufficient accuracy to generate usable fire control solutions, a capability that requires space-based sensors, over-the-horizon radar, and a data processing and communications architecture that can translate raw sensor data into actionable targeting coordinates within the time windows that ballistic missile engagement requires. Iran has invested heavily in exactly this architecture. The integration of these sources into a unified targeting picture, processed and transmitted to launch units with the speed and reliability that operational execution demands, is the command and control achievement that made tonight's engagement possible. The world has been informed, through tonight's operational demonstration, that Iran possesses a genuine carrier-killing capability. That information changes the strategic calculus of every naval power that has built its force projection doctrine around the aircraft carrier, and most specifically it changes the calculus of the United States. In the hours following the confirmation of the Abraham Lincoln's loss, Washington entered a state of institutional crisis that has no precedent in the living memory of anyone currently serving in the American national security apparatus. This is not hyperbole. This is the accurate characterization of what happens when the foundational assumption of a superpower's military doctrine is invalidated in real time, at maximum visibility, with 6,000 missing personnel as the human face of the failure. The immediate crisis management challenge facing the administration was itself a compounding disaster. The carrier's loss could not be concealed. The engagement occurred in waters monitored by the satellite assets of multiple nations, and the debris field, the rescue operations, and the operational withdrawal of surviving strike group vessels were visible to commercial satellite imagery within hours. The administration faced the simultaneous requirements of managing a genuine military catastrophe, communicating to the American public a loss of a scale and character for which no modern precedent exists, and making real-time strategic decisions about escalation and response in an environment of incomplete information and maximum institutional stress. The response options available to Washington were each, in their own way, catastrophically constrained. The instinctive military response, strike back, strike hard, demonstrate that American military power cannot be challenged without devastating consequence, required a targeting package against Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure that the dispersed, hardened, mobile basing architecture of the Sejjil force made impossible to execute with the decisive effect that the political requirements of the situation demanded. Striking Iranian territory without destroying the missile force that caused the loss would demonstrate American reach without demonstrating American invulnerability, a messaging outcome potentially worse than restraint. The Hormuz dimension paralyzed every escalatory option in the available response menu. Iran's capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz through mining, through anti-ship missile coverage, through submarine operations, through the fast attack craft swarm doctrine that Iranian naval forces have spent decades refining, means that any significant American military action against Iranian territory carries an immediate economic retaliation risk of global consequence. Oil supply disruption at Hormuz scale transmits through global energy prices to every economy on the planet within days, generating inflationary and recessionary pressures that arrive in American households and American ballot boxes with a directness and a speed that no administration can politically absorb. The nuclear dimension, never far from calculations involving this level of direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran, added a further layer of constraint. Any American escalation that Iran's leadership assessed as threatening regime survival would push the nuclear calculation in directions that American strategic planners treat as the ultimate red line. Every escalatory option that crosses new thresholds must be evaluated against that constraint simultaneously. The congressional dimension compounded the executive branch's paralysis. The loss of 6,000 sailors demands a public accounting that classification requirements conflict with. The political opposition's response to a military catastrophe of this magnitude will be shaped by domestic political imperatives that have no relationship to the operational realities in the Persian Gulf. The administration faces a Congress that will demand action, while constraining the options available for action through the mechanisms of public opinion, appropriations authority, and the war powers framework. Allied responses added further complexity. The Gulf state partners, whose security architecture depends on American military presence and commitment, are conducting emergency strategic reassessments. The calculation that has led Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha to host American military assets and align their security postures with Washington's regional strategy was predicated on the assumption that American military power in the region was decisive and survivable. The sinking of a carrier by Iranian ballistic missiles introduces a variable into that calculation that fundamentally changes its output for every Gulf state capital. When 5 carrier strike groups sink, 5 security guarantees lose credibility simultaneously. European allies whose own security commitments are underwritten by the credibility of American military capability are absorbing the implications of the carrier loss with a concern that extends far beyond the immediate regional situation. If the carrier strike group, the platform American deterrence most depends upon beyond the European theater, is vulnerable to Iranian ballistic missiles in the Persian Gulf, what does this imply about American capability commitments in other theaters against adversaries with comparable or superior missile capabilities? The answer to that question, being reached simultaneously in Warsaw, Tallinn, Seoul, and Tokyo, is not the answer that Washington needs those capitals to reach at this particular moment in global strategic history. The panic that has gripped Washington is not the panic of a power that has lost the will to fight. It is the panic of a power that has lost, in a single operational engagement, the strategic instrument its entire regional doctrine was built around, and that faces the realization that replacing that instrument, recalibrating that doctrine, and restoring the credibility that the loss has damaged will require time, resources, and strategic creativity that the immediate crisis does not allow. There is a moment in the strategic history of every nation that chooses the path of resistance against a dominant power. A moment when the investment, the sacrifice, the decades of patient preparation converge into an operational demonstration that validates with absolute clarity the strategic choice that was made. For Iran, that moment arrived in the waters of the Persian Gulf, when the first Sejjil warheads found their targets on the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck. This validation is not simply military, it is civilizational. The Islamic Republic has argued since its founding that a determined nation with genuine strategic purpose, willing to absorb the costs of resistance and invest in the capabilities that make resistance viable, can defend its sovereignty and project its interests against a superpower that possesses overwhelming conventional military advantages. For 4 decades, this argument was tested by sanctions, by covert operations, by military threats, by the assassination of scientists and commanders, by cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, by every instrument of coercive power that Washington and its partners could bring to bear short of direct military invasion. Iran did not capitulate, it adapted. Every sanction that denied access to foreign technology became an incentive to develop indigenous capability. Every assassination that killed a program leader became an institutional memory that hardened program security and accelerated its timeline. Every cyber attack that disrupted a production process produced a cybersecurity lesson that made the next attack harder. The Sejjil program is the most complete expression of this strategic culture. Developed under sanctions that made every component procurement a challenge, requiring indigenous solution or creative circumvention. Tested and refined under surveillance that required the development of operational security practices sophisticated enough to conceal the program's true state of advancement from intelligence services with global reach. Deployed in a dispersed, hardened architecture, specifically designed to survive the preemptive strikes that American and Israeli planners would execute against a concentrated visible force. The institutional knowledge, the engineering talent, the operational doctrine, and the command culture that produced tonight's engagement were not purchased from a foreign supplier. They were built, refined, and validated by Iranian scientists, engineers, military commanders, and political leaders who made a generational commitment to the proposition that Iran's security and strategic sovereignty were worth the price of building them from the ground up. This depth of institutional investment produces a quality of strategic will that external actors consistently struggle to model accurately. Western strategic assessments of Iranian capability have repeatedly underestimated not just the technical achievements of the Iranian defense establishment, but the organizational resilience, the doctrinal sophistication, and the operational discipline that converts technical capability into battlefield effect. Tonight's engagement was not a lucky strike. It was the operational output of an institution that has been preparing for this specific mission, defeating an American carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf for the better part of 2 decades. The contrast with the American institutional response illuminates something important about the current moment in global strategic history. American military power is real, it is formidable, and it is not in question. What is in question is whether the strategic culture that wields that power, one shaped by decades of uncontested dominance, by the institutional assumption that American technological superiority constitutes an unanswerable argument, can adapt with sufficient speed to the threat environment that adversaries like Iran have been deliberately constructing. The sailors of the Abraham Lincoln brought every professional skill and institutional commitment that their training produced to the defense of their ship. They were not outfought in the human sense. They were out-architected. caught inside an engagement envelope that their mission planning had not fully modeled, by a weapon system that their defensive architecture was not specifically optimized to defeat, executing a strategic concept that their adversary had been refining for 2 decades, while their own institution was managing the operational demands of a dozen other theaters. That is the hardest truth that the Abraham Lincoln's loss forces upon the American strategic establishment. Not that American sailors failed, not that American technology is inferior, but that the strategic competition for dominance in this specific operational environment was decided years ago, in Iranian missile design bureaus and underground launch facilities and classified operational planning sessions, by an adversary whose clarity of strategic purpose produced an investment discipline that the institutions of American military power did not match. The sinking of the USS Abraham Lincoln is not a Middle Eastern event. It is a global event, one that will reshape the strategic calculations of every government, every military establishment, and every alliance structure on the planet in ways whose full dimensions will take years to become visible, but whose direction is already unmistakable. The aircraft carrier has been the defining instrument of American global power projection since the Second World War. Its symbolic and practical significance extends far beyond its military capability in any specific operational scenario. The carrier represents the capacity to bring American air power to any point on the globe, to sustain that power indefinitely through nuclear propulsion and underway replenishment, and to do so without the political constraints that basing agreements and host nation permissions impose on land-based air operations. The carrier is American hegemony made steel and nuclear fuel, a visible, mobile, undeniable demonstration of the will and capability to project force globally. When that instrument is sunk by Iranian ballistic missiles in the Persian Gulf, the demonstration being delivered to the global strategic audience is not simply that Iran has a capable missile program. It is that the foundational instrument of American global dominance is vulnerable in ways that change the strategic calculations of every actor that has been making decisions on the assumption of American naval invulnerability. China is the actor for whom this demonstration carries the most immediate and most profound strategic significance. Beijing's primary strategic challenge, deterring American military intervention in a Taiwan contingency, is centered on exactly the question that Iran has just answered operationally. Can ground-based ballistic and cruise missile systems defeat carrier strike group defenses sufficiently to make American naval intervention in the Western Pacific prohibitively costly? China's own anti-ship ballistic missile program, the DF-21D and DF-26 systems that Western analysts have labeled carrier killers, has been developed on the same strategic logic as the Sejjil program. Tonight's engagement provides the first large-scale operational validation of that logic against the specific defensive systems that American carriers carry. The strategic implications for Taiwan are immediate and severe. The credibility of American security commitments to Taipei rests substantially on the assumption that American carrier forces can operate in or near the Taiwan Strait in a crisis. If the Persian Gulf engagement has demonstrated that carrier strike groups cannot survive sustained ballistic missile assault at the volume that China's DF-21D and DF-26 inventory can generate, the operational foundation of that commitment has been challenged in a way that American political declarations cannot simply override. In Beijing strategic planning sessions tonight, the engagement data from the Persian Gulf is being processed with intense professional attention. Every aspect of the targeting architecture, the saturation concept, the electromagnetic warfare integration, the terminal guidance performance, all of this is directly applicable to Chinese operational planning against American naval forces in the Western Pacific. Russia's response to the carrier's loss reflects a posture of careful, calibrated satisfaction. Moscow's technical cooperation in radar systems, electronic warfare, and missile guidance technology has contributed to the Iranian strategic capability foundation. The operational validation of capabilities built in part on Russian technical foundations represents both a vindication of Russia's strategic technology export decisions and a demonstration of the global reach of Russian defense technology influence. In a period when Russia faces its own sustained Western pressure, The message delivered by Iran's operational success, that Western conventional military superiority can be challenged and defeated by nations willing to invest in the right asymmetric capabilities, resonates directly with Moscow's own strategic narrative. The Gulf states are undergoing the most acute strategic reassessment of any regional actor. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait have built their security architectures on the foundation of American military presence and commitment. American air and naval assets based on their territory have been understood as the ultimate guarantee of their security against Iranian military threat. The sinking of the Abraham Lincoln forces each of these governments to confront a question they have been able to avoid for decades. What is the actual value of an American security guarantee when the instrument of that guarantee has just been defeated by the power it was supposed to deter? The answers being reached in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are generating a strategic flexibility, a willingness to explore alternative security arrangements, to engage with Iranian diplomatic overtures, to reduce the visibility of American military cooperation, that represents a fundamental shift in the regional political architecture that American strategy has depended upon. The global energy market response to the carrier's loss is itself a strategic event of the first order. Oil prices have moved to levels not seen in the modern era, driven by the combination of Hormuz vulnerability, regional instability premium, and the reassessment of American capacity to guarantee Gulf security that the carrier's loss has triggered. These price movements transmit through every energy-importing economy on the planet, creating inflationary pressure, reducing growth, and generating the kind of social and political stress that historically produces strategic realignments. The international institutional response has confirmed what the pattern of recent crises had already suggested. The multilateral frameworks constructed to manage great power competition and regional conflict have lost the capacity to perform that function in an environment where the power relationships underlying those frameworks have shifted. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. Regional organizations lack authority. The arms control frameworks that once provided structural constraints on missile development have been abandoned or eroded. The crisis is unfolding in an institutional vacuum that the existing international order has no mechanism to fill. What is emerging in the space that the old order is vacating is a genuinely multipolar strategic environment, one characterized not by the stable bipolarity of the Cold War or the managed unipolarity of the post-Cold War decade, but by a fluid, complex distribution of power in which multiple actors possess the capability to impose unacceptable costs on others, in which no single power can project force with the confidence of unchallenged dominance, and in which the rules of strategic competition must be negotiated on foundations that the old order never provided for. The Persian Gulf is still. The search and rescue operations are winding down. The debris field that was the USS Abraham Lincoln spreads across coordinates that every naval planner on the planet has now memorized. The fires have gone out, but the strategic fires lit by this engagement will burn for decades. In every naval war college, in every defense ministry, in every alliance headquarters where the credibility of American security guarantees forms the foundation of collective security arrangements. The questions being asked tonight have no comfortable answers. Can the aircraft carrier survive in the threat environment that Iran has operationally demonstrated? If not, what replaces it as the instrument of American global power projection? And can that replacement be developed, built, and deployed before the strategic vacuum created by the carrier's vulnerability is filled by the actors whose interests are served by American strategic retreat? Can American deterrence credibility, the belief among both allies and adversaries that American military commitment means what it says, be rebuilt from an event of this magnitude? And if it can, at what cost, across what timeline, and through what strategic choices that the current domestic political environment may or may not support? And most fundamentally, what kind of world is this, in which a nation that Washington spent decades trying to sanction, isolate, and coerce into submission has developed the capability to sink an American aircraft carrier? What does that world require of the nations that must navigate it? And who has the strategic vision, the institutional capacity, and the clarity of purpose to shape its emerging order toward toward outcomes that serve human security rather than simply the interests of those best positioned to exploit the chaos of transition. Iran has provided its answer in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The rest of the world is now required to provide its own. What is your assessment of the strategic consequences of the Abraham Lincoln's loss? Does this change the fundamental calculus of American power globally, or does Washington have the capacity to absorb this and rebuild? Drop your analysis in the comments. Every perspective sharpens the picture. If this breakdown delivered the strategic clarity that this moment demands, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next phase of this crisis is already developing. Stay sharp, and we will see you in the next.